What if the Latin American powers survived? In our own timeline, what is now Latin America used to be colonies of Spain and Portugal for Brazil. The Spanish colonies were divided into four viceroyalties, namely the Viceroyalty of New Spain in modern-day Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean and southwestern United States, the Viceroyalty of New Granada in modern-day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador and Panama, and also parts of Brazil and Essequiba, the Viceroyalty of Peru in modern-day Peru and Chile, and lastly the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata in modern-day Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay and Uruguay. After they gained independence, the borders of course changed. New Spain and New Granada largely stayed united as the Mexican Empire and Gran Colombia, albeit with Spain holding on to its Caribbean holdings. But after the dissolution of the one-year-old Mexican Empire, the Federal Republic of Central America declared independence only for it to collapse into Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua and Costa Rica. Gran Colombia would fall into Colombia, Venezuela and Ecuador, with Panama later also gaining independence. Considering that Peru and Chile didn't share a border, it isn't surprising that they split into Peru and Chile. Lastly, Bolivia, Paraguay and Argentina gained independence from Rio de la Plata, with Uruguay falling to Brazil. Brazil meanwhile declared its independence under Pedro I. Latin America nowadays is mostly weak and often was forced to comply with the United States even against their own interests, or else faced coups sponsored by the US. But what if that didn't happen? What if the Latin American powers survived? In this timeline, both the Mexican Empire and Gran Colombia survive. I'd give Peru Bolivia instead of Chile because for one they share a border, second they were both liberated by Simon Bolivar, hence the name, and thirdly, because they were from 1836 to 1839 united as the Peru-Bolivian Confederation. Lastly, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay and Uruguay unite as the Republic of Rio de la Plata. One way for the Mexican Empire to endure is maybe by having influential people like Santa Anna being more in favor of the monarchy, thus legitimizing it. Gran Colombia could have worked if instead of wanting to centralize it, Simon Bolivar instead federalized it into a system similar to the United States. Without Chile existing, it is in the realm of possibility that Peru-Bolivia endures. Lastly, Rio de la Plata makes the least sense and might only work through military conquest from Buenos Aires. Alternatively, maybe an expansionist Britain might force them to unite, similar to the German states during the Franco-Prussian War in our own timeline. As for Brazil, not much would have been changed, as they would, just like in our own timeline, declare their independence from Portugal under Pedro I. The change comes with Pedro II's son Pedro Alfonso not dying. This resulted in him having no male heir left. He didn't believe the empire could survive with an empress, as he thought that the people wouldn't accept this, and thus didn't fight on to make sure that the empire stays alive. With that, the stage is set, and four powers, namely the Mexican Empire, Republic of Colombia, the Peru-Bolivian Confederation, the Republic of Rio de la Plata and the Brazilian Empire, stand strong in Latin America and go toe-to-toe to the United States of America. Mexico would be in this timeline almost like a bulwark against the gringos up north. Americans probably still manifest their destiny and move west, coming in contact with Mexico. Americans would then still move into Mexico, or more specifically Tejas, and the Republic of Texas would fight for its independence. But with Mexico being a lot stronger, the prospects of this succeeding are significantly diminished, and the Republic of Texas might just remain a part of Mexico. If a Mexican-American war were to break out over Texas, it is possible that Mexico holds its own and manages to push back the Americans. But other than retaking Texas, I doubt they would seriously try to take more, as Mexico simply couldn't afford a new and even larger and more rebellious Texas. However, this could be used by the United Kingdom to force the United States to cede most of modern-day Washington to the British. In 1848, the Whigs likely don't nominate Zachary Taylor, as he wouldn't be a glorious general, but instead Henry Clay. The Whigs likely win even harder, being able to flip Mississippi, Alabama, Virginia, Illinois and maybe even Indiana and Wisconsin. In 1852, Henry Clay still dies and his vice president, probably Theodore Frelinghuysen, succeeds him. He could just as well win the election of 1852 as lose it, but in 1856 James Buchanan becomes president, and in 1860 Abraham Lincoln. The Civil War would still break out and would probably be won by the North. Mexico meanwhile wouldn't be plagued by civil war after civil war. The Pastry War and the Second French Intervention in Mexico also wouldn't happen. Gran Colombia would endure as a prosperous state even after the death of Simon Bolivar, and would utilize the strength of all of its members would benefit all. A Panama Canal could still happen, but it likely would be called the Columbia Canal or the Bolivar Canal. In Venezuela, oil would be found eventually. The nation could prosper like Guyana in our own timeline or suffer like Venezuela in our own timeline, but I think the first one would happen. Peru-Bolivia would be the least interesting and arguably weakest of these Latin American powers, but at least wouldn't lose the War of the Pacific. It is possible but unlikely that eventually Gran Colombia and Peru-Bolivia unite into the Andean Federation, thus fulfilling Simon Bolivar's dreams of a strong power in that area. Rio de la Plata would take over Patagonia as there is nobody else to compete with similar to our own timeline. Rio de la Plata would almost certainly come at odds with the United Kingdom in this timeline, especially over the Falklands or Isles Malvinas. The strength of Rio de la Plata comes mainly through the Rio Parana, the second largest river in South America only behind the Amazon, with a watershed that stretches out all the way to Bolivia. The Paraguay War would be prevented in this timeline for a multitude of reasons, meaning 90% of Paraguay's male population wouldn't die. Brazil would also be more prosperous without the coffee and milk republic of our own timeline and might industrialize. While a Spanish-American war is still possible, just as likely is a Spanish-Mexican war in which Mexico is the one to declare war on them to take Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam and the Philippines, as they used to be part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, of which Mexico is its legal successor. By the turn of the century, these five Latin American powers might rival or even in some ways even surpass the United States, as for example Argentina had before World War I a similar GDP per capita as the United States, and Rio de la Plata might just as well surpass the United States. I doubt that any one of these five countries would join the First World War, but unlike in our own timeline, the Zimmerman telegram isn't sent as Mexico already controls Texas, New Mexico and Arizona. Without a Zimmerman telegram, the United States don't join the First World War. Germany would be able to knock France out of the war with the summer offensive in 1918. After that, a phony war sets in with the British before they finally agree to cease hostilities. The war might get used by some of the Latin American powers to expand their realm. Mexico could theoretically take British Honduras or modern-day Belize, while Colombia could settle the Essequibo dispute with force and then maybe even take all of British Guyana. Lastly, Rio de la Plata could take the Isles Malvinas. Germany probably improves relations with Latin America and signs some trade deals. The Great Recession would not nearly be as devastating as in our own timeline, as for one, the United States aren't as economically dominant as in our own timeline, and second, the Great War wouldn't elevate the United States. It would be condensed to the United States, thus making Latin America more dominant, and ultimately Germany the global hegemon economically. A Second World War would likely be a rematch, one that would be won by Germany and its allies once more. The attack on Pearl Harbor could be aimed against Mexico in this timeline, thus resulting in them joining the war and being one of the victors. A Cold War like in our own timeline is unlikely, and if one exists it would be fundamentally changed and not recognizable at all. With the U.S. not being able to exert influence in Latin America, coups by the CIA wouldn't happen. Without a Second World War and with Texas a part of Mexico, Dwight D. Eisenhower wouldn't be president and MSIB, instead Harold Sturson. His vice president and future president could be Nelson Rockefeller, as Nixon too wouldn't exist. In 1960, John F. Kennedy nominates Stuart Symington as his running mate, and he become president after his untimely death, and he might still get the Civil Rights Act through. In 2008, Hillary Clinton would get the Democratic nomination and defeat John McCain, but loses in 2012 to Mitt Romney, who wins re-election in 2016. With a richer Latin America, immigration would likely be smaller, and thus a smaller issue in the United States. In this timeline, Mexico, Gran Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, Rio de la Plata and Brazil are all regional powers that go toe-to-toe with the United States. Germany wins World War I in this timeline. Lastly, Latinos in this timeline wouldn't be called Latinx. If you liked the episode, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe. Goodbye.